Good. Good time to start with you making that appearance from behind that beautiful Aberdeen People's Press banner. I would like to welcome everyone this afternoon for what is going to be a pretty amazing talk. As you will know from the information we've disseminated, this talk is part of an exhibition called Another World is Possible, which is an exhibition that reappraises the work of Aberdeen People's Press in the city of Aberdeen in the 70s and early 80s. The exhibition, Aberdeen People's Press operated between 73 and 84, publishing a fortnightly alternative local newspaper, pamphlets and books, as well as providing a printing service for a wide range of radical groups, community newspapers, trade unions, and campaigning organizations. In addition to its printing and publishing activities, Aberdeen People's Press also acted as a hub, a meeting place for many of the city's activist groups, a node in a wide network of people and communities across the city, Scotland, and the UK. For people of visual arts, this exhibition is a way of expanding its focus on fine art printmaking to embrace harder, more transient forms of print. It's also a reminder of the common roots of PVA and APP in the politically exhilarating years of the early 70s, when ambitious projects were built with imagination rather than money. As I said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce David Francis, whose title for the talk is "One Does Not Compromise with a Society in Decay." David has worked in Aberdeen People's Press from 1979 to 1984. His activities now center on what are known as the traditional arts, as a storyteller, songwriter, guitarist, singer, and dance scholar, a life entwined with his other life as what he calls a folk bureaucrat, as director of the Traditional Arts and Culture Scotland, the organisation behind the Scottish International Storytelling Festival, amongst other things. As a musician, David is known for his work with his wife, Mary Campbell. The duo was nudged into the spotlight in temporary solvency when their version of Robert Burns' original setting of Auld Lang Syne was picked up for the film Sex and the City a few years ago. He lives by the sea in Portobello, Edinburgh's Riviera, with Mary and their ancient cat, Duster. Before I pass on to David, I would just like to remind you that this talk is being recorded. We are still learning about the technology of Zoom. We've received a comment from someone around the kind of the interactivity and the visibility of other people. So we'll be working on a more, non-hierarchical, more horizontal form of exchange. So if you want to ask a question, you can either do it via the little chat tool on the right-hand side, or you can also show your face, in which case I would have to promote you to panelists, which I'm more than happy to do. So for the extroverts there, you might want to ask your question and be seen. Introverts might want to just type the question down. We're very happy with either way, but let us know. Without further ado, very exciting. I'm very excited to hear your talk, David.
Thanks, Nuno. Thanks for the big build-up, and thanks to you and Neil Correll and Andrew McGregor for all the work that's gone into this exhibition. It's been really great to reconnect with old colleagues, or should I say former colleagues, and reflect on what Aberdeen People's Press represents and what it's meant for the city and for ourselves at what was a formative stage of our lives. So in this short talk, I want to briefly touch on the idea of the counterculture and what it was counter to, and to maybe make a wee distinction between counterculture and alternative society. I'll talk about how some of the key ideas from the struggle to set up alternatives have been adopted by civic society in Scotland, but perhaps in a way that doesn't allow them to truly flourish and meet their true potential. Social enterprise and community empowerment are the examples that I'm using, and I'll briefly discuss how these are framed. In the 15 or 20 minutes or so that I've got, there's obviously going to be a lot of generalization and not much detail, but we can possibly address those shortcomings in the discussion afterwards. So, Kenneth White, the Scottish poet and philosopher who's long been resident in France, says that different stages of Western history are characterized by a central motif that dominates the shape and course of society in that epoch. For him, it's the idea from the Greeks that the sun orbits the earth, the Virgin Mary in medieval times, the subjection and domination of nature in the Renaissance and its corollary in the Age of Reason. And for the 20th century, arguably the central motif was the death wish. The world had seen military deaths on an industrial scale in the early part of the 20th century, and then in the mid-century, unprecedented levels of both civilian and military deaths, compounded by the particular horrors of the gulags and concentration camps, and also the destruction of 2 Japanese cities by atomic bombs. The pall from that last event continued to hang over the latter part of the century. Citizens lived with the knowledge that those entrusted with power in the world's most powerful states were prepared to sacrifice them in an exchange that would result in the absurdity of mutual destruction. E.P. Thompson, the great socialist writer, coined the term exterminism to describe that absurdity as a kind of crazy logic working its way out of the very foundations of a culture based on competition, subjugation, expropriation, and accumulation. So nuclear weapons still exist, of course, but exterminism might also apply to our current predicament as the planet inexorably heats. And in the meantime, like a child faced with the inevitability of bedtime and asking for 5 more minutes, capitalism whines for just one more oil field or just one more runway. But the cultures that flowed from those central motifs, of course, also met with countervailing ideas. Copernicus, the Reformation, Romanticism, and the bomb culture was no different. Despite growing affluence after the Second World War, there was a growing resistance to the notion that we'd never had it so good. Resistance that the height of aspiration was 2 cars in every garage and a chicken in every pot. And with the threat of imminent destruction ever present, that resistance began to take shape, not just in political terms through the medium of leftist political parties, but in people's minds and in the way that they began to live their lives. It was in fact an affirmation of life. Theodore Roszak coined the term counterculture to summarize this critique of cultural norms, standards, the qualities that were valued in the dominant cultural currents. And it was a critique that addressed the foundational ideas of capitalist society and its distorted mirror image in the East. The counterculture was saying no to Francis Bacon and the hounding of nature, no to Descartes and his mechanistic universe, no to the idea that knowledge arrived at through reason and observation is the only kind of knowledge worth having. Shakespeare wrote that the lunatic, the lover, and the poet are of imagination all compact. And the counterculture was saying yes to the non-rational, yes to William Blake, the Kama Sutra, Buddha, and Carlos Castaneda. Yes to imagination and intuition and the expansion of the mind through narcotics. Sous les pavés la plage, free your ass and your mind will follow. Yes to an opening of the doors of perception and the dawning of a new age. Of course, some aspects of the counterculture were fatuous in the extreme. The ideas of putting LSD in the water supply or levitating the Pentagon and all the rest of it. And some of the legacy of the counterculture is less than edifying. I would say the rise of a criminal class based on drug profits, new age quackery of every description, conspiracy theories. And it struck me that some of the people who invaded the Capitol in Washington back in January wouldn't have looked out of place at Woodstock. But in the ferment of ideas that came out of that time, one of the most beguiling was the idea of an alternative society, prefigurative models of the kind of society being strived for, rejecting both the private and profit-oriented of capitalism and the public and planned of state capitalism in favour of the social and the mutual. The vision was and is social structures that are collective, democratic, non-hierarchical, that would be exemplars of other ways of living that would eventually be widely adopted as the rightness for the realities of the human condition began to be recognised. That was the idea, anyway. As the title of the exhibition has it, another world is possible. Alternative modes of doing things were explored in every field of social living: the workplace, health, community work, education, agriculture and husbandry, sexuality. Everyday life was politicized. And I thought I would read an extract from this book here by Charles Landry and three others, What a Way to Run a Railroad, an Analysis of Radical Failure. And they describe that politicization of everyday life in semi-serious terms, saying that the day of the fully occupied or total activist had dawned. It became obligatory to wake up active and move through a day of committed childcare, politicised teaching in a polytechnic or college of further education, a union meeting at lunchtime, a support group and campaign meeting in the afternoon, an early evening meeting at a radical project, and the final exhausted collapse into a collective house meeting to round it all off. But in another part of the book, Landry and Co. also write that about how difficult it is to sustain a critical and oppositional project in a society which is structured at all levels against it. The construction of a truly alternative society was always impossible, and compromise was inevitable. Electricity, fuel, transport, materials, all had to be acquired from the infrastructure of the society that was to be changed. I think back to APP and a project that was an important part of the alternative society's infrastructure that was dependent on industrial machinery and materials, chemicals, metals and films, non-recycled paper, none of which were supplied by the co-op down the road. For all our utopian objectives, we and every other project like us was embedded into the world in which we've been born and which we were required to navigate and negotiate. That negotiation became more and more difficult as the 1980s dawned. In the UK, an all-out assault on working class institutions was accompanied by a hostile economic environment for both private and state-run industry. Recession and interest rates at 15% and more were putting the squeeze on, and our lack of reserves and, to be honest, lack of business acumen, a quality we probably saw as ideological, was to prove fatal not just to APP but to a host of contemporary projects. Vision and collective working weren't quite enough. As the political blogger Jules Evans puts it, the flame of charisma requires the coal of institutions with proper business plans. Otherwise, the flame soon burns out. But I want to suggest, though, that the ending of that historical moment should not be considered a failure. Some of the ideas that the alternative society was proposing 40, 50 years ago now have elided into the mainstream of policy, if not in the full flood, at least as an undertow. The focus on the social and mutual in the shape of social enterprise and community empowerment in particular have been incorporated into both legislation and government support. Social enterprises are businesses that trade in the marketplace but whose key objectives are social or environmental. And through their trading activities, they might tackle social problems or aim to have an environmental impact. All profits are reinvested back into the business, and although social enterprise isn't a legal category, there are characteristics that must be in place, such as an asset lock, that enable a business to be considered a social enterprise and to qualify for support. The Scottish Government has both a social enterprise strategy and a social enterprise action plan. It supports key organisations in the sector: Social Enterprise Scotland, Social Firms Scotland, which creates opportunities for people disadvantaged in the labour market, the Social Enterprise Network, SENSCOT, and the Social Enterprise Academy, in addition to providing millions for organisations that provide direct financial support in the form of grants and loans for the sector. SENSCOT produced a map a couple of years ago, a bit like the London Underground map, which I'll show you just now. Which gives you some idea of both the scale and the complexity of the sector. This is I think, a rather brilliant piece of work. If you come along and you're a social enterprise and you want a particular kind of, looking for a particular kind of support, then you enter in the outer circle and then follow the routes round that suggest different organisations that you can get in touch with in order to help you. And as you can see, they are legion. Unfortunately, they have abandoned that as their main support and replaced it with a much more straightforward list. But if, for example, if I was a social enterprise and looking for development support, I would go to this website and click on that, and there you are. There's 47 different organisations that can offer different kinds of support for you as a social enterprise, which I think gives you an idea of the scale of this particular sector. And you may have seen on the map there, on the co-op front, there's now an arm of Scottish enterprise called Cooperative Development Scotland, which gives advice to anyone wanting to set up a co-op. And the attraction of co-ops has been quite persistent over the years. Long before there was such a thing as the Scottish Government or even a Scottish Parliament, APP was connected with a body called the Scottish Cooperative Development Committee. Although I'm not sure how much progress has been made in this area in the intervening 40 odd years. I don't have exact figures, but even counting in the old style retail co-ops, the number of co-ops in Scotland remains quite small. All of this activity is in the context of the Scottish Government's stated aim of the creation of a fairer, stronger and more democratic economy. And yet in a Scotland that has over £1 trillion in personal wealth, 44% of that wealth is owned by 10% of its households. Not quite as stark a figure as the famous 784, but stark enough. And inequality is rising. Capital and land interests still have a firm grip on the economy. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation estimates that 1 in 5, a million Scots, are living in relative poverty. And it might be fair to assume that, say, 10% of that figure, 100,000 of those are either homeless or close to destitution. So the government's rhetoric has echoes of those alternative society days, but you do have to wonder about the intention. Turning to community empowerment, every Scottish town has some once thriving building, now redundant and dilapidated, but that has great potential as a community asset. And up until now, up until the passing of the Community Empowerment Act, communities would have been left to bemoan the fate of that asset with no clear mechanism for bringing it into community control. Now, however, the Scottish Government is aiming to support communities to do things for themselves through the application of the Community Empowerment Act. Community empowerment links civic and civil society. So what's the distinction between the two? Civil society has differently nuanced definitions, but we take it to refer to what is sometimes referred to as the third place, the place in society that is not the home or the workplace, but is also distinct from government. And as community work veteran Lawrence DeMarco says, citizens not under the direction of any authority wielding the power of the state. So it's the everyday world of social life, the voluntary association of people coming together to pursue a common interest. And what Wikipedia describes as the aggregate of non-governmental organisations and institutions that manifest the interests and will of citizens independent of the government. Civic society is somewhat different. It's the local state where citizens participate in local health boards, schools, community councils, planning partnerships, and all the other mechanisms that are ultimately under the direction of the state. It's a space where citizens are invited to participate, but not necessarily on their own terms. Empowerment and participation have two different perspectives. Once people have been empowered, either through their own agency or through the loosening of external power, authority rests with them in the civil sphere. Democracy, which theoretically distributes power, is dependent on citizen participation. But participation, however, implies that authority still rests with those in power in civic society. Citizens in societies where power is concentrated in few hands, despite the appearance of democracy, often have the right to participate in elections, but with little influence on the inherent power structures. As Lawrence DeMarco, whom I mentioned a moment ago, observes, the structures of power militate against community empowerment and discourage it. Civic society has a tendency to move into civil society's space. Well, that struck me that is Guy Debord, the French philosopher, socialist philosopher, and his conception of recuperation in a nutshell. Debord defined recuperation as the activity of society as it attempts to obtain possession of that which negates it. That's worth repeating. The activity of society as it attempts to obtain possession of that which negates it. And Debord's other great insight, which resonates greatly in the present day, is the idea of the spectacle, whereby in daily life the projection of class power reduces reality to an endless supply of commodifiable fragments, as he put it. Being declines into having, and having into merely appearing. So, although the tenets of the alternative society and the present day Scottish Government share a vocabulary, and although they operate in seemingly similar domains, the processes by which they achieve their objectives are different. And underlying that, perhaps the objectives themselves are different. One aims to integrate people and projects into the logic of the system, while the other seeks to redefine the system, enabling people to be the agents of their own liberation. One operates in a directive way, dictating outcomes, the urge always towards the centre of power, while the other still hangs on to the idea of grassroots democracy, where community life is self-determined and the state is the enabler, not the director. It's the latter idea that emerged out of the alchemy of countercultural ideas, alternative visions, political possibilities, and the experimentation that swirled around in the alembic of that period from the mid-60s to the early 80s. It's an idea that I, for one, still hold to, however naively, and Aberdeen People's Press was one of the many projects that was both shaped by and shaped those times, and I'm very pleased to have been part of it. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks for that, David. That casting of the net really, really wide, and amazing scholarship, shedding light on concepts and ideas that we come across on a daily basis, but often quite and critically. I was wondering, before we progress to the questions, how do you bring together these ideas of the current social enterprises with Charles Lange's affirmation that the construction of an alternative society is impossible? Exactly because all of these social enterprises are very much, trying to almost offshoots of a kind of a capitalist project of society.
Yeah, it often seems to me that what social enterprises are trying to do is fill gaps where the state is unwilling to act or unable to act. It's a kind of, I think if you looked at a lot of social enterprises, you would find that their clients are actually local authorities or other state organisations. That and those are the kind of clients that they need in order to remain viable. So I think that's what I was suggesting was that the current setup sort of points in the direction of an alternative society, but is very much bound up with the state apparatus at the moment. I mean, I don't know how much kind of awareness of the radical possibilities of social enterprise exists amongst the people who are involved in it. I don't know. Just
ask you another question, just ahead of opening up. What are the most interesting manifestations of that idea of civil society that you come across on a kind of a daily basis or around you in Scotland currently?
I think one of the most interesting ones I find is the whole there's a growing community gardens movement where people are using restoring either gardens that have gone out of use or using derelict land to grow food for local consumption, possibly in areas that suffer from a degree of food poverty, and a lot of these are self-organized by people in those communities, possibly with a little bit of professional help when it comes to all the details of planting and composting and so on. But I think that's something where that emphasis on the local and local action has actually got a really positive outcome in that people can actually see the connection between the work that they do and the food that they eat at the end of the day. Yeah, that's one I find really quite exciting.
Thanks for that. I would like to now open it to questions. If you would like to raise your hand, anyone within the attendees, to ask David a question about his fabulous talk. I can see Andrew in the chat saying that there's one of such gardens in Tilladrone called Earth and Worms, and they're doing great stuff. And there's Chris Alderwood says that there's one in Torrey as well. So this type of activity is obviously happening here in Aberdeen as well. Okay, Andrew McGregor, I know that he wouldn't mind to be promoted to panelist, so we can see his face as well. Andrew?
Yep. I'll go first. I went first last time. Hi, Dave. That was fantastic. I was saying in the chat, you need to do podcasts because I was just listening. That was absolutely fantastic. That's the most intelligent seminar I've ever heard. That was fantastic. One thing I was going to say to you is, and you didn't speak about, but we didn't mention it much in the exhibition, was the Big Print, which was a newspaper that followed Aberdeen People's Press. And I know you were involved in that. And I wonder if you could say anything some more about that, and because it was a much more a political paper in that it said it on the front page. It was going to be a libertarian socialist paper, and that was that. You know, there was no. It said it straight out. So I wonder, for people who have not heard about it, if you could speak about that, how that came about, and how you felt that fitted in with the whole what you spoke about today.
Yeah, it was interesting. Big Print. I think it survived for about 20 issues. I think it was probably just under 2 years, and it started off basically to fill the vacuum that was left after the Aberdeen People's Press fortnightly paper stopped publishing. Big Print was monthly, I think, and yeah, you're right. It initially it was much more straight up in its sort of political intentions, but it was interesting that as the paper went on, that kind of fell away a little bit, and I think the latter issues of the paper probably bear more resemblance to the old APP than to the kind of hard hitting earlier issues. It was interesting as well from a design point of view, because there was early issues wanted to present itself much more as a newspaper, so it was printed on A3 sheets, but of course APP wasn't web offset, so those A3 sheets just simply had to be stapled together, which actually looked a little bit amateurish, and then it reverted to the A4 format after I think about half a dozen issues or so, and then had a fairly comprehensive redesign. Well, probably design would be a better term, because because it had no design at all prior to that, which Alan Marshall did for the Big Print Collective. So yeah, it and I think towards the end, as I say, it kept up the political stories. It was quite active on things like when the St Nicholas Centre was first being built, around the property deals to do with that, and those kinds of issues. But probably parts of it sort of shaded into leopard territory towards the end, and that probably just reflected the interests of the people that were actually became part of the collective.
Okay, thanks.
Right. I've got Lizzie here. She's joining us. Hi, Lizzie.
It's exciting. It says you have been promoted when when they pick you to be panelists. Hi everyone. I guess mine's less print related, I'm sorry. Although I guess it has a relation to media. When you were talking about this question about, I guess, how complicit we can be in an already capitalist society, and it reminded me of something when I was, I think, in my late teens, and the Occupy movement was in full swing, and they had occupied Paternoster Square in London, the London Stock Exchange. And I remember that my parents always watched Have I Got News for You, which is very, very mainstream TV, kind of pretending to be some kind of alternative voice, but it's like super, super mainstream media broadcasting. And I remember this argument that is actually really stuck in my head that happened between the panelists, which is maybe the most interesting thing that I think's ever happened on this show, which was there was Louise Mensch, who's a Tory MP, was the person, the host that week, and she was criticising the Occupy protesters for making a huge queue outside Starbucks, because they were all protesting, doing the Occupy protests, but then they were going to Starbucks to get coffees when they woke up in the morning. And she said the phrase, how can you criticize this society and then take everything it has to offer? And then some of the more left-wing panelists were arguing with her and saying it's not everything, it's a cup of coffee. Also, Starbucks were kind of letting people use their toilets, etc., etc. And there was this argument. And I found it really interesting question. I suppose the point of how much is everything? What point should you sort of draw the line and be like, okay, that form of capitalism we should boycott, or that's too much of a compromise for it to be okay? And what things do you have to be like, well, this is the world that we're in, you take it and then you complain anyway? And I think it was sort of interested me as well, because I felt like maybe this thing about individual decisions, for example, like boycotting somewhere like Starbucks. I sometimes wonder whether they have the potential to be kind of more like this theory that there's a kind of like pressure being released rather than building up, so that instead of having a revolution, you feel like you're doing your bit, and that whether, for example, doing little individual boycotts maybe actually are just kind of keeping people happy to sit at home and watch Have I Got News for You, which is another example of a little kind of like way for the pressure to escape rather than build up. Mm-hmm. Or whether that's all we can ever do is small individual actions, and it doesn't matter if it doesn't build something greater, because at least they make you feel like you have some agency in your own life.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I mean that speaks to really quite profoundly, I think, to the means by which we effect change, you know, because in some ways choosing to boycott Starbucks doesn't change very much, but then again neither did the demonstrations in Paternoster Square change very much either. So yeah, these kind of things are almost a sort of spectacle in themselves, in a way. I mean, I don't have the answer.
Oh no, I wouldn't even expect you to have the answer. It's just kind of like, I suppose, musing about what these thinking about just the difficulties of this even as a question, or how you go about.
Yeah. I I mean,
are you existing in a society that is flawed in this way?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that, you know, that example that you gave of Louise Mensch, who sort of sees capitalism as a sort of benign provider, you know, and that you know, it shouldn't, you know, Starbucks shouldn't be criticised on that level.
Yeah, I mean, I almost felt she was kind of using it more as like Starbucks was just a handy thing to beat the protesters with, like maybe whether Starbucks was benign or not, but they were useful to her because I think they're an example of a kind of bogeyman of the kind of globalized world.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's kind of, they're just like the tempting thing that was used to tempt people into showing their hypocrisy, I suppose, from her point of view.
But then if you want a cup of coffee, what are you going to do?
Bring a thermos, if not a thermos, bring an unbranded hot water, hot liquid. Or maybe, you know, next Occupy 2.0, we should think about these things.
Yeah.
Kind of like cooperative coffee production.
It's a great question. It's a great topic, and it really speaks to the, I mean, to the fact that there's a kind of almost an all-encompassing structure that kind of dominates society, and we're trying to create pockets of difference and imagining society otherwise within that framework rather than outside it. So the connection between what we're doing and that overall structure is tense, and you know, this, you know, there are many examples in the past, mostly kind of revolutionary examples where that thing was pierced. Anyway, I would like to invite Fiona Napier to ask a question as well. So I'm going to ask Fiona to unmute herself and ask the question, please. Fiona.
Can you see me okay?
Yep.
Hi, Andrew, everybody. So my question was just really about, you know, with all the community initiatives and social enterprises that are starting up, including the gardens you were talking about, David, the community gardens. I just wonder if you feel, or if the panel feels, that there's been a shift. You know, are people still asking permission to do these things, or are they just doing them? And if they're told, no, you can't do that, you know, do you feel that there's a growing movement of people just saying, well, I'm just going to do it? And how was it, you know, the sort of like what you've been talking about there with Aberdeen's People's Press and the, you know, the initiatives that were happening then, has there been a change, do you think?
I don't know. It's quite hard to generalize. I think a lot of people who start up social enterprises or community initiatives, for example, you know, do them in response to circumstances, and you know, no, probably don't ask for permission. But I think the point is that, you know, once you've actually made that decision to start up your project, that there's an apparatus of support there that didn't exist before. So in a sense that, you know, at quite an early stage, you can be drawn into an official apparatus in a way that wasn't the case, you know, 40 years ago, because that simply didn't exist. So there was much more of a feeling of being outside the system, if you like. You know, despite what I was saying about also being dependent on it, we still mentally felt that we were at least in part outside the system. Whereas now, I think because of this much larger state enterprise, you're much more likely to feel that you're part of the system.
And so how do we change that? Because until we have enough people who are prepared to not just accept the system and how things are, then how far can we go?
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think this sort of turn towards social enterprise and community empowerment is, on the whole, is a positive thing. Despite all the sort of philosophical caveats that I had around about it, I think it is a good thing, and I think that there are the seeds of quite deep-rooted change there, if that particular economic sector can grow larger in some ways. So yeah, I see it as a positive, definitely as a positive thing.
Okay, thanks, Lizzie.
Do you feel like the links between the land reform movement and, for example, the SNP, but just in general, some of the kind of Scottish government commitments to take seriously some of the findings from reports into land ownership, which has resulted in the community right to buy, is having like an impact that's more than just like a kind of spectacle or a visual impact of things looking better, that it's actually having has the potential to kind of change quite significantly how people feel the possibilities of doing things for themselves rather than waiting for a civic organisation to fix things for them.
I think that what will happen is that, having initiated this sort of turn to community empowerment and so on, that it's going to let a lot of energies off the leash. Although the SNP government, I think, is tremendously centralising in its outlook and in the way that it deals with things. I think that once more community empowerment starts to happen through the mechanisms of the Act and through the community right to buy and so on, that it's actually going to create a momentum that's probably going to result in something quite new. That's my hope, anyway.
Very good. Are there any other questions, maybe from the attendees? If you'd like to raise your... yes, Chris, would you mind if I brought you in as a panelist and we can... While Chris is joining us, Andrew is saying in the little chat window that there are currently 2 workers' cooperatives in Aberdeen. One's Black Cat, the Moorings, and the other one is Bonobo Cafe.
Yeah.
Sorry, hi. I really wanted just to ask about Dave's view of the different influences of the radical left and the community radicals in that period of interest in ideas of changing society, and the sort of uneasy relationship between some of the groups you've described having a left-wing agenda and some who had that much more communitarian approach. And how do you see that playing out now?
Yeah, I think you're right that there was always that tension between, particularly organisations that aim to be non-hierarchical and to do away with the structures of political parties, and I think that the politicos saw that as being kind of undisciplined in a way, and just too contingent, and probably without an overarching end point in mind, which certainly the Marxist political parties had. I think in present day terms, I think the influence of the sort of formal left wing has really diminished enormously, and that's really as a result of what has to be characterized as the success of the conservative agenda since the late 70s. I think in a lot of ways, that the left suffered enormous defeats in that respect. The union power was altered, and that was considerably diminished, and that was such a power base for so much that happened on the left. And of course, in Scotland, the Labour Party is now almost a spent force, and the other left parties, despite a kind of wee rally at the beginning of the Scottish Parliament, are really nowhere to be seen now. So that whole communitarian movement, that is found in the third sector is probably much stronger than it was 40 years ago, but it probably has no kind of ideological thread tying it all together. So as I say, I think there's a lot of optimism to be found in the growth of that movement, but that there probably needs to be a bit of for it to become truly radical, there needs to be some kind of philosophical stiffening there, which I don't see at the moment. Although there are organisations like Enough and the Common Weal and so on that are trying to provide some of that, but it's very difficult for them to get any kind of focused attention. I think they're there on the internet, and the internet provides a platform, but it's very difficult to focus attention onto it.
Thanks, David, for that. I was wondering, we've still got about 6 minutes left ahead of wrapping up, so I'm wondering are there any more questions?
I'm just wondering what Alan's asterisks portend.
Yeah, there's a little bit at the end that needs to be filled in, so I don't know if you want to take that, whether it's a question or a comment. I was inviting Alan to maybe voice that thought, but
I think what is interesting is libertarian socialists is not as a term I use, but it's such an old. You don't hear anybody say that nowadays unless they're well, I'm sure somebody is, but I say it quite a lot, and I think you do wonder if I say it enough, it might become a thing. But it's quite an interesting thing, and the big print said it on the front page. It's a libertarian socialist newspaper. It even said it in the. So it's maybe making a comeback.
Yeah. Well, of course, the term libertarian's been fairly majorly hijacked by the right as well. So it's probably one that people would be reluctant to use.
I've got a wee comment here from Lee French. I was just thinking about the recent Glasgow City Council SNP leadership claim of no more bad old Labour municipalism. except that's not existed for a long time, or rather it's been systematically eroded for many decades now through new labor boosterism that ran aground, inward investment failing to materialize, hence the fallback reliance on the internationalization of student cohort. Yes, it's more like a comment. I don't fully get the last bit, but Alan is also saying that a failed comment on the permanent coexistence of various very different political and non-political sensibilities. It's constantly repeating, as Margaret did in the previous talk, that there were many political allegiances under the banner of APP, and that made it very rich altogether, and especially those two that Chris is mentioning. You know, a group with a very strong communitarian approach, and a group that maybe aligned more with that libertarian left that you guys are talking about. We've got a couple of minutes to wrap up. I don't know if you want to say anything else, David, to wrap up.
No, other than to just reiterate the point I think that was made in the last talk, that the APP as a you know, as a provider was very broad in terms of the people that came to have work printed there. You know, it ranged from, you know, the political left right through to the community movements and protest movements of single issue movements of different kinds, and also, you know, plenty that were none of these things as well. I think there probably existed a demarcation in our minds of people that we wouldn't print for, but it was never made explicit. And I think we probably all felt, you know, who we would print for and who we wouldn't. It's a kind of visceral thing. I think
what you say is reflected in the exhibition. I mean, the sheer amount of work that you guys have produced. You know, as the oil was coming into town, you know, to kind of generate certain antibodies and critical reflections about the oil's impact on the several spheres of society, namely, you know, education, housing, you know, many others.
I think the slideshow in particular is a really good reflection of that. So again, spend 10 minutes in front of that.
I would like to thank David Francis for his generous and erudite talk, but also thank all the attendees that took the time to come and you know, be part of this conversation. I'm really happy that we again managed a second talk in the series. There will be 5 talks. You can come onto our social media or website and be able to book your free ticket for any of these events. If you're in town, please come and visit Peacock Visual Arts. And again, thank you all for another amazing afternoon.
Thanks. Thank you, Nuno. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks, David. It was really, really great talk. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Well, for organising it.